When people imagine cavemen, it usually involves a club, a fur loincloth, and someone yelling, "Ugh," while dragging something unfortunate across a cave floor. But the real story, it's quieter than you think, slower, stranger, and surprisingly relatable. Because most of the time, prehistoric humans weren't inventing fire or fending off saber-toothed tigers. They were trying to wake up without frostbite, arguing over whose turn it was to fetch firewood, digging for roots that hopefully weren't poisonous. They weren't just surviving, they were parenting, problem-solving, swatting flies with the original version of a sigh. So tonight, we're not going on a big hunt or discovering the wheel. We're doing something rarer, following a normal day in the life of early humans, from first blink to final firebank. And spoiler, they were more than just grunting cave guys with bad hair. Before we begin, feel free to like or subscribe, but only if this kind of quiet storytelling feels right to you. Now dim the lights, maybe pull a blanket a little closer, and let's travel back to a day where everything was at stake, even breakfast. When you hear the word caveman, your brain probably runs through a greatest hits reel of cartoon tropes. Someone with tangled hair and zero indoor voice, a cave smeared in handprints, a club dragging behind them like a security blanket made of wood. Maybe they shout something inspirational, like "ugh," and bonk things into submission. Thanks, Saturday morning television. But the truth? Cavemen didn't spend their entire day thumping things and inventing fire every 5 minutes. They weren't running around like chaotic toddlers with muscles. Life, real prehistoric life, was far more routine, and in many ways, painfully ordinary. Sure, they had their dramatic moments. You don't live in a world where hyenas outnumber fire pits and not get a little drama. But the majority of their time wasn't spent fighting beasts or painting on cave walls. It was spent doing what humans still do today, figuring out what the heck to eat, how to stay warm, and how to not completely lose it while living in a small space with other people who snored. Even the word caveman is misleading. Not every prehistoric human lived in a cave. Some did, many didn't. A cave was more of a seasonal Airbnb, a decent place to crash when the weather got weird or the mammoths got grumpy. But people also built huts, shelters, and sometimes just slept under the stars with their hair full of sticks and a spear within arm's reach. And let's talk about that club, shall we? There's no evidence everyone carried one around like it was some ancient fashion statement. Tools varied depending on the group, the terrain, and whether your cousin had already borrowed your spear again without asking. In truth, they had a surprisingly complex toolkit. Stone blades, fire-hardened digging sticks, scraping tools, even early sewing needles carved from bone. If anything, they'd be offended at being reduced to a single blunt object. Then there's the idea that they were simple-minded, that prehistoric humans were just one notch above raccoons in terms of intellect. This couldn't be further from the truth. The early human brain was essentially the same size as ours. These weren't beasts in loincloths. They were inventors, planners, survivors, and above all, adaptable. They understood the movement of animals, the change of seasons, the types of plants that could kill you, and the ones that just tasted really bad, but kept you alive anyway. They knew how to start fires, build traps, dry meat, and teach children. And when the rains came or the winds shifted, they moved, as a group, as a unit. So no, they weren't stomping around clubs first like prehistoric bouncers. They were parents, foragers, builders, quiet strategists living in a world where nature didn't care how tired you were. And while they may not have had written language or Wi-Fi, they passed on knowledge through generations, not in textbooks, but in songs, signs, stories told by firelight. If you think that sounds romantic, you're not wrong. But it was also necessary. Because forgetting how to dry fish properly didn't just mean dinner was ruined. It meant your whole group got violently sick, and that wasn't a risk you took lightly. In short, the modern caveman stereotype is wrong, loud, and frankly kind of rude, because these people weren't just surviving the harshest environments Earth had to offer. They were doing it without complaining, without Netflix, and without socks. There was no snooze button in the Stone Age, no gentle alarm tone, no sun lamp slowly brightening the cave, no scented diffuser promising forest renewal. Waking up as a prehistoric human was less about starting the day and more about surviving its first 5 minutes. You usually woke up because something demanded it. Maybe it was a gust of cold wind finding its way into the shelter. Maybe it was the dull ache of sleeping on packed dirt with only an animal hide between you and the chill of the earth. Maybe it was the baby crying, or the boar snorting outside, or a particularly enthusiastic beetle exploring your eyebrow. Whatever it wasn't pleasant. Most mornings began with the same ritual: a cautious stretch, a half-blind reach for something warm, and a quick internal scan to make sure you hadn't frozen one side of your body stiff overnight. If your fingers worked and your nose still had feeling, congratulations. You were doing great by prehistoric standards. And yes, you slept with others. Often lots of others. Families, extended relatives, maybe even a neighbor who didn't technically ask to sleep over, but also didn't leave. Personal space wasn't a thing, unless you were the kind of person who enjoyed sleeping outside with wildcats, which, historically, didn't end well. The inside of the shelter smelled like a confusing mix of smoke, fur, old meat, people breath, and wet earth. No one said, "Good morning." That wasn't a vibe yet. What you did say was something like, followed by a pointed glance toward the fire pit to see if anyone had kept it going through the night. Because fire was everything. If the embers were dead, your day just got harder. Someone had to breathe life back into the coals, or worse, restart the fire from scratch. And if no one had dry kindling, time to tear up part of the wall again. Don't worry, you'll patch it later. Probably, once you had enough warmth and light to see the outlines of limbs and tools. You checked your gear. Spear still there. Good. Fur cloak not stolen by that one cousin again. Even better. Footwear intact. You were ahead of schedule. Next came the morning inspection. Did anything happen overnight? Were there new animal tracks near the entrance? Was the food stash still safe? Had the smoke hole collapsed again? It probably had. Then came the real moment of reckoning, stepping outside. The first breath of morning air was less a greeting and more a slap, crisp, earthy, and just wet enough to make you wonder if you should have layered your layers. Your feet hit the ground and immediately reminded you why fire was so important. The dirt was freezing, always freezing. If it was winter, the ground might crunch beneath your toes from frost. If it was summer, it was still cold, just in a way that made your ankles ache instead of your soul. And yet, there was beauty. The mist curled low over the grass. Birds you didn't know the names of made strange clicks and songs. Your breath steamed in front of you like a signal to the sky. I made it to another day. No one journaled that feeling. They just picked up their baskets, slung their tools, and got moving. Because dawn didn't wait. There was food to find, firewood to gather, and children already asking if the soup was ready. It wasn't. It never was. There were no emails, no morning scrolls, no frantic sprints to the bathroom. But the pressure was real. Because if you didn't move quickly, nature moved faster. Forget pancakes. Forget coffee. Forget sitting. Breakfast in the Stone Age wasn't a plate. It was a plan. And if you were lucky, it didn't involve chewing bark or arguing with a squirrel over a berry bush. See? The idea of 3 meals a day with designated times. That's a modern luxury. For early humans, eating was opportunistic. You ate when there was food. You stopped when it ran out. And if something wasn't trying to kill you, it went in the pot. A typical morning meal wasn't served. It was scavenged. Maybe there was leftover meat from yesterday's hunt, dried over the fire or buried in ash to keep it from spoiling. Maybe someone found eggs before a fox did. Maybe someone spotted honey and then remembered bees exist. But the truth, most mornings started light and earthy, as in nuts, roots, and whatever berries hadn't fermented into squirrel wine overnight. The older members of the group were usually first to stir the coals and check the food stash, not out of respect, but because younger people knew better than to get between them and the last strip of dried fish. There was no table, no plates, no forks. Breakfast happened in clumps. Whoever was awake gathered around the fire, trading bites of smoked something and guessing whether it was deer or possibly raccoon. If someone was chewing too quietly, someone else would ask, "Did you cook that?" And the reply would be something like, "Mostly." Kids didn't get cereal. They got tasks. Find acorns. Shake the bush until something falls out. Don't eat the red ones. That kind of thing. And while they foraged, adults discussed logistics in the simplest terms possible. Need more wood. Tracks near the stream. Something took the hide. And then, inevitably, who moved the marrow bones? Because that was Stone Age gold. Marrow was one of the richest calorie sources they had, and no one wanted to admit they licked one clean during the night, even though everyone did. If meat was around, it got shared, but not evenly. Elders, nursing mothers, and hunters usually got first pick. Everyone else? They learned early that a hot rock with beetle larvae was technically protein. It wasn't good, but it was chewy-ish. And don't think liquids were simple either. There was no orange juice, no herbal tea, no water bottle with motivational timestamps. You wanted a drink? You hoped the stream hadn't frozen, or dried up, or turned weird colors from something upstream. You knelt down, cupped your hands, and drank fast. Because sometimes the water was shared, with animals, or worse, upstream relatives. And yet, with all this, there was rhythm, a kind of hungry choreography. Someone scraped bark, someone else gnawed a root. A child proudly held up a wriggling grub like a prize. People sat close, leaned in, made sure no embers sparked the food pile, and breathed the quiet steam of survival. No one called it breakfast. It wasn't a moment. It was momentum. Fuel for the next thing, which, 9 times out of 10, involved walking very far and lifting very heavy things. There was no morning commute, just a lot of walking, some carrying, and a constant awareness that something out there might be hungry and faster than you. The day didn't begin at 9 a.m. It began when it was light enough to see your hand, or when someone shouted, "Tracks!" and half the camp was already moving. Forget calendars. Forget weekends. Forget jobs that involve chairs. If you were alive during the Stone Age, you worked. Period. And by worked, we mean you walked, you hunted, you built, you sharpened, you fetched, and you occasionally ran for your life. There were no supervisors, just your stomach. And maybe someone in the clan yelling, "If we don't patch that roof, we're sleeping with the rain again." So what exactly did you do all day? Stone Age living meant everything was constantly falling apart. The shelter roof sagged, patch it with bark. Spears went dull, resharpen with flint. Fire pit collapsed, restack the stones. Foot got cut on a rock again, scream quietly and keep going. You didn't get PTO for repairs. You just hoped today's fix wouldn't become tomorrow's injury. You needed food, not just for today, but for a week from now, when hunting might fail. So you foraged, constantly. Berries, mushrooms, carefully. Edible roots, wild onions, nuts, leafy greens, bird eggs, and anything that looked vaguely chewable. If it didn't taste awful and didn't kill you within 24 hours, it got added to the safe-ish list. Someone always carried a basket. Someone always tested something questionable. And someone always said, "I think that's the one that made Uncle sleep for 3 days." Even while working, eyes were always scanning. For predators, for rival groups, for storms, for that weird rustling noise that turned out to be a very bold porcupine. There were no fences, no security cameras, just instinct, spears, and one guy in the group who always said, "It's probably fine," right before it wasn't. You didn't just have a hammer, you made your hammer, and then you had to remake it when the handle cracked from weather or overuse, or when someone used it to smash open a nut and flung it into the bushes. Blades dulled fast, rope frayed, nets unraveled, and the one good axe? Everyone swore they didn't lose it, but it still vanished weekly. Maintaining tools was a job in itself. And if you didn't do it, well, good luck scraping meat with a stick. Then there was the task of hauling everything back before dark, because when the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods got loud, the shadows got long, and the phrase, "I think something's following us," was not how you wanted to end your day. So you carried your day's labor, whatever you'd caught, cleaned, carved, or cut, and trudged back to camp, usually tired, sometimes limping, often hungry, but still breathing. And that counted as a good day. Hunting wasn't a sport. It was survival wrapped in bruises, mud, and the vague hope that today's plan didn't end with you becoming lunch instead of getting it. You didn't just wander into the forest with confidence and a stick. You needed tracking skills, teamwork, and a willingness to get way too close to animals with teeth the size of your fingers. And most days, you came back with less than you left with. Tracking wasn't just about footprints. It was broken branches, trampled grass, droppings, scent, sound, and the particular way a deer snaps a twig, but a bear doesn't. Sometimes you followed prints for hours. Sometimes they disappeared into rocks or water. Sometimes you realized they were a full day old and cursed the wind for blowing the scent away. Sometimes, worst of all, you followed prints and realized they were getting fresher and were now behind you. That's when you stopped caring about dinner and started praying not to be dinner. You had to choose your weapon wisely. Spears were the classic, heavy, carved, balanced by hand, thrown or jabbed, and usually reused unless it broke, or lodged in something that ran off, or ended up in a tree because someone got nervous and missed very badly. Bows came later, but early versions, short range, inconsistent tension, and arrows that bent if you sneezed on them, still better than a sharp stick. You also had clubs, rocks, slings, and occasionally a pit covered in leaves and hope. Planning the hunt was all about teamwork. One group flushed the prey, another waited, a third tried not to scream when something unexpectedly ran their direction. Communication wasn't done through walkie-talkies. It was hand signals, bird calls, an urgent whisper shouting like, "No, that's left. Left." Someone always stepped on a loud stick. Someone always tripped. But when it worked, you could surround a wild boar or drive a deer toward a trap. And when it didn't, you got a good cardio workout and a story about how the mammoth looked way smaller from a distance. Actually landing a hit was only half the battle. Now you had to finish the job, quickly, cleanly, and before the prey limped off with your only decent spear. Then came the butchering. No grocery store, no plastic wrap, just stone blades, bone saws, and hands that were going to smell wild for days. You used everything: meat, hide, sinew, bone, fat, even the stomach for water storage. Waste nothing. That was the law. Even a small rabbit became hours of work. A larger kill could take the whole day, or attract scavengers who were much faster and far less polite. You'd think the hard part was over. It wasn't. Now you had to drag 100 pounds of meat through underbrush, across creeks, and past animals that had definitely noticed the smell. Sometimes you shared the load with a partner. Sometimes you made a sled. Sometimes you cursed your choices and hauled one leg at a time. And if a predator started trailing you, drop a piece, run faster, and hope you weren't the slowest one in the group. Most hunts ended in nothing but sore legs and mosquito bites. But on the days you succeeded, the whole camp ate. Fires were stoked, tools were resharpened, and you got the highest praise a hunter could hear. Hey, next time, bring back 2. If you're imagining prehistoric kids running wild like a Flintstones episode, barefoot, carefree, yelling something between a yodel and a battle cry, you're not entirely wrong. But being a kid in the Stone Age meant a lot less leisure and a lot more try not to die before your next birthday. There was no school, no chores chart, no go to your room because, well, there were no rooms. Just one smoky, animal skin-lined shelter with everyone inside. All the time. Privacy didn't exist. And if you annoyed the adults enough, your punishment might have been sent out to gather sticks in a forest known for wolves. By the time you could walk without falling into the fire pit, you were expected to help. Small hands carried water in slippery animal bladders, fanned embers, or mashed berries into questionable pastes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. You learned fast, or you didn't make it long. No one sat you down for a lecture on responsibility. You just watched what the older kids did, copied it, and hoped you didn't lose a toe in the process. Children mimicked adults constantly, throwing sticks like spears, pretending to track invisible prey, making clay into pretend bowls that looked more like sad pancakes. But that was the point. You weren't playing. You were rehearsing. Even simple games, like tag, taught something. Speed, reflexes, spatial awareness. Sure, it was fun, until someone ran headfirst into a tree and learned about concussions the old-fashioned way. No helmets. Just a slap on the back and a "don't do that again" if you were lucky. And forget about the idea of childcare. The older kids were the childcare. If your little sibling cried or wandered too close to the fire, you dealt with it. If they tried to eat something poisonous again, you pulled it from their mouth and hoped they didn't drool it back onto your foot. Dropping the baby. Not ideal, but dirt builds character. As you got older, the expectations grew heavier. You followed your parents out into the forest, watching how they hunted, gathered, or set traps. No quizzes, no praise. Just observation and repetition. One day, you might be sharpening a tool. The next, being trusted to use it. Ideally not on yourself. If you asked too many questions, you might get a shrug, a half-remembered story about someone who tried that once and died, or just a rock. Sometimes that was the answer. A rock. Figure it out. Kids also had to help keep the fire going. That meant blowing on embers, feeding it sticks, and not letting it die out, which was basically the prehistoric version of don't close the laptop lid before saving your essay. Lose the fire, and everyone's mad at you for a week, or dead. When winter hit, the jobs didn't stop. If anything, they got harder. The firewood had to be dry, the walls needed patching, the food needed stretching. There was no snow day, only don't freeze to death day. At night, there were stories. These weren't bedtime tales with fairies and moral lessons neatly tied up at the end. They were part hunting tale, part weather report, part warning, and yes, part toilet humor. Because some things, it turns out, are timeless. Kids listened with wide eyes, learned how not to anger the spirits, how to avoid certain mushrooms, and how to laugh when someone's cloak caught fire because they sat too close to the hearth. Again, by the time you were 10, you weren't a kid anymore. You were expected to contribute, fully, seriously. Childhood ended early. But if you'd made it that far with most of your fingers intact, you were already ahead of the curve. By the time you were old enough to help with hunting, foraging, or even just chewing something without choking on it, one thing became clear. Food wasn't just a meal. It was an ordeal. In the Stone Age, no one asked, "What are you in the mood for?" You ate what didn't kill you last time. That was the menu. Breakfast? That depended on whether anything was left from the night before, and whether it had been stolen by raccoons, wolves, or that one cousin who always accidentally took the biggest portion and claimed it was an honest mistake. Again, there were no set meal times. You ate when there was food, which meant most of the day was spent either looking for it or recovering from the last time you ate the wrong thing. Foraging was basically grocery shopping on hard mode. You wandered into the woods with a vague memory of what wasn't poison and hoped the berries hadn't turned on you this season. You learned quickly that colourful didn't mean safe. Sometimes it meant this will make you see sounds. And mushrooms, that was a gamble every single time. People figured things out through trial, error, and watching what happened to the other guy. If he started foaming at the mouth, not that one. If she seemed fine after an hour, maybe edible. Add it to the maybe pile. Meat was precious, but hunting was exhausting and incredibly risky. You had to sneak up on something larger than you, faster than you, and often much angrier than you. If you came back with meat, you were a hero. If you came back limping and empty-handed, you still got credit for trying. Unless you dropped the spear, in which case people talked behind your back for weeks. Most of the time, you ate whatever was available. Roots, nuts, grubs, tubers, bark. Fruit, if it wasn't rotted, and once in a while, honey. If you were willing to go one-on-one with a beehive. And yes, some people did that. That's how badly they wanted dessert. When the hunt was successful, it was a big deal. The entire group gathered, and the meat was divided with a mix of ritual, fairness, and thinly veiled passive aggression. But don't picture a perfectly cooked steak with herbs and sides. Picture a chunk of half-smoked animal flesh, lightly seasoned with ash, dirt, and someone's foot. They didn't waste anything. Bones were cracked open for marrow, skins were dried for clothing, and organs were, unfortunately, eaten too. Raw, if needed. Cooked, if you had fire. Burned, if someone got distracted mid-roast and now everyone's chewing charcoal. Drinks? Water, if it was clean, which it often wasn't. Or snow, if you didn't mind the brain freeze and the mild panic that came after you remembered the last person who drank from that spot got stomach cramps for a week. And yet, somehow, they survived. They learned what worked, passed it down through quiet instruction, or grunts that roughly translated to, "Don't eat that unless you're ready to meet the ancestors." Food was fuel. It didn't need to taste good. It just needed to keep you alive long enough to do it all again tomorrow. And after a long day of chewing bark, chasing birds, and stealing eggs from cliffs you had no business climbing, you finally sat by the fire, aching, bruised, a little bit smarter, and shared whatever scraps you'd managed to gather. No plates, no napkins, just grease-covered fingers, burned lips, and the kind of silence that only comes after survival. Tomorrow, the menu might be the same, or worse, but at least you weren't the one who ate the mystery mushroom. Daytime was busy, noisy, full of scrambling, searching, scraping, chasing, chewing, arguing. But when the sun dipped low behind the trees, when the shadows stretched across the ground like claws, everything slowed. Not because people wanted it to, because they had to. Darkness wasn't just a lack of light. It was a different world entirely. One where predators crept closer, where cliffs looked like paths, and where every sound made you freeze, just for a second to ask yourself, was that wind or something breathing? There were no flashlights, no night lights, no glow from windows down the block. The only light came from the fire. If you were lucky enough to have kept it alive through the wind, the damp, and that one cousin who kept knocking over the embers, people huddled near the flames, not just for warmth, but for comfort. The fire crackled, sputtered, smoked. It spat little sparks and cast shadows that danced across the cave walls like spirits telling stories of their own. And in that flickering circle of light, life paused. You couldn't do much after dark. You couldn't gather, couldn't hunt, couldn't really even walk without risking a twisted ankle or a sudden drop. So you sat, you listened, you waited. Sometimes stories were told, not with grand theatrics or polished delivery, but with gestures, grunts, and words that carried the weight of survival. Tales about the hunt, the storm, the one time the river flooded and took all the baskets except that one really sturdy one with the weird smell. Sometimes elders spoke. Sometimes they just stared at the fire, and everyone took the hint. Tonight is for silence. Children often fell asleep right there, faces smudged with ash, curled up against a sibling or the family dog, or whatever softish thing was available. Adults stayed awake longer, listening, watching, guarding, because even though you were inside, tucked into your shelter of wood, bone, hide, or stone, you were never far from the things that lurked just beyond. Wolves didn't knock, bears didn't ask permission, and the cold seeped in through the walls like it had an invitation. So someone always stayed up, not all night, but long enough to make sure the fire didn't go out, and the night didn't come in. Those hours between last light and the first frost taught people patience. You couldn't rush them, you couldn't fill them, you just had to live them. Some picked at their tools, sharpening blades or tying nets by feel. Some traced patterns in the dirt with soot-covered fingers, lost in thought. Some whispered to themselves, or to the fire, or to the gods they hoped were still listening. And every now and then, between the crackle of logs and the distant rustle of leaves, came laughter. Low, tired, but real. Because if you couldn't laugh in the dark, what else was there? Eventually, even the watchers dozed off, cheeks warm, backs cold, eyes heavy, and the fire burned low. Outside, the world pressed in, but inside, in that little circle of fading warmth and stubborn humanity, life held on. Tomorrow, they'd wake with stiff necks, sore joints, and the same two thoughts. Is there food? And did the fire survive the night? If you were lucky, you woke up to glowing embers still tucked under the ash. If not, you woke up shivering, staring at a lifeless pile of soot and wondering who was supposed to be on fire duty. Answer: nobody remembered. Everyone blamed the cousin who sleeps with his mouth open. Getting out of bed, if you could call it a bed, was a trial. Every bone popped. Every muscle protested. The air was sharp enough to slice through your nose and remind you, immediately, that yes, your breath was visible again. That wasn't steam. That was survival. First thing, check the fire, poke it, blow on it, whisper bribes. If the embers responded, you were a champion. If not, it was flint and frustration, round two. And don't even think about letting the kids help. They'd turn a simple fire-starting session into a reenactment of a forest fire, indoors. Next, the morning shuffle. You'd wrap yourself in whatever animal hide was closest, maybe still warm from someone else's armpit, and step into the cold dirt. Your toes curled instantly. Your spine shrunk. Your brain whispered, "Why are we like this?" But the chores didn't care. Water had to be fetched. From a river, a stream, or a frozen puddle with a hopeful crack in the ice. Someone always fell in. Someone always came back soaked. And somehow, someone always managed to spill the bucket halfway home. Breakfast? Not a feast. More of a negotiation. A little dried meat if you had it. Maybe some leftover tubers. Maybe some nuts if the squirrels hadn't claimed them first. Occasionally, someone found a half-frozen berry and tried to convince everyone it was still good. And yet, there was rhythm to it. A slow, groggy rhythm, like a drumbeat with one stick missing. The kids grumbled. The elders coughed. Someone sneezed and everyone froze. Not because they were scared of getting sick, but because sneezing made the roof dust fall into the porridge. Then came the fire dance. Not a real dance. More like an awkward shuffle around the hearth, trying to warm fingers, backs, and butts without catching your fur skirt on fire. It was a delicate balance. One wrong lean, and suddenly you were the morning entertainment. Singed hair and all. The brave or the foolish stepped outside to scout. They checked for tracks, watched the horizon, cursed at the wind, squinted at the sun and tried to guess what time it was. The sun, of course, gave them nothing. It just sort of hung there, dim and indecisive, like it hadn't had its morning coffee. But still, life continued. They shook out sleeping mats, rehung tools, grunted greetings, took a deep breath and muttered something that roughly translated to, "Let's try not to die today." And somehow that was enough. Because caveman mornings weren't about motivation speeches or green smoothies. They were about waking up, facing the cold, and deciding, quietly, stubbornly, not to quit. Even if your nose hairs froze. Even if your breakfast tasted like pine bark. Even if you accidentally stepped on a hedgehog again. You survived the night. That counted for something. Tomorrow would come fast. And it would ask the same question winter asked every single day. "You still here?" And with a grunt, a sip of lukewarm broth, and a muttered insult to the sky, you answered, "Yeah, I'm still here." Once everyone was up, semi-lucid, and no longer actively accusing each other of hogging the hides overnight, the real work began. Not optional work. Not maybe later, if I feel like it, work. This was do it or starve work, which, it turned out, was pretty motivating. No one had a job title. You weren't the head of procurement. You were just the guy who knew where the decent rocks were, or the woman who could turn sinew into something that wouldn't fall apart mid-hunt, or the child who knew which mushrooms didn't kill you. Expertise didn't come with certificates. It came with stories, usually starting with, "Okay, so the first time I did this wrong." The morning's first major challenge. Dividing up the labor without arguing too loud. Too much noise risked scaring off prey, or worse, attracting something hungrier than you. The strongest took up spears and clubs, heading out to hunt or scavenge. Their steps were cautious but practiced. They didn't talk much. Talking was warmth wasted. The gatherers set off too, usually in pairs or small groups, eyes down, hands busy, minds tuned to the forest floor. Berries, nuts, roots, bark. If it could be chewed and didn't kill you, it was worth collecting. Sometimes you found something incredible, like honey tucked in the cold crack of a tree. Other times, just a log full of ants, and that log still came home. Everyone else stayed back, working the tasks that kept camp from collapsing into complete chaos. One person patched up the windbreak with grass and mud. Another sharpened stone tools or retied fraying rope. A third crouched near the fire, doing their best to smoke the meat from yesterday without burning it into prehistoric charcoal. And all the while, eyes scanned the horizon. Ears stayed tuned to every crunch, snap, and whistle of wind. Because survival wasn't just about doing your part, it was about watching everyone else's back. If someone didn't come back by dusk, no one slept easy. If a wild animal was spotted, the news traveled faster than fire. If a tool broke or a stash was spoiled, it affected everyone, not just the person holding it. There were no individual victories out here, only shared meals, shared injuries, shared laughter when someone slipped in the mud and claimed it was tactical. Even children had roles, not just pretend chores, but real responsibilities. Scaring off birds from the drying racks, gathering kindling, watching the smoke trails to predict weather shifts. No one was too small to matter. No one was too important to avoid blisters. And the strange thing, sometimes, it worked beautifully. A rabbit snared, a fish pulled from beneath the ice. The thrill of coming back with something, even if it was small, felt like a minor miracle. There were no thank you cards, just a silent nod. Maybe the bigger piece of meat passed your way later that night. Cooperation wasn't some noble idea. It was the only way the fire kept burning, the only reason there was broth to sip and hides to wrap around your shivering knees. Because out here, surrounded by cold, hunger, and creatures that didn't believe in personal space, you learned quickly, survival was never a solo act. Sometimes things just fell apart. A tool snapped mid-hunt. Someone slipped into a ravine. A child woke up with a cough that didn't go away. Or the sky changed suddenly and without warning, and the wind started to carry something colder than usual. There wasn't a word for emergency. There wasn't a designated fix-it person. Just the shared understanding that if something broke, you didn't wait. You acted. If a hunter didn't return, the camp grew still. People stared into the trees like the forest itself might answer. Sometimes they sent a pair to search. Other times, they waited until morning, hoping not to hear howling before dawn. Injury was common. There were no crutches, no antibiotics, and definitely no gauze. A bad fall meant bark splints and chewed up herbs packed into wounds. Blood was cleaned with snow. Pain was handled with silence. And if someone couldn't move, then the group moved slower. That was the rule. Sickness was trickier. The line between just a bad cold and everyone's about to get it was razor thin. If someone started coughing, you could feel the tension in the firelight. Mothers clutched children a little tighter. People leaned away, but never too far. Because even when it was dangerous, leaving someone behind never felt right. So they adjusted. Fewer people near the food, extra herbs in the boiling water. A quiet, collective prayer, not the kind with gods and temples, but the kind where everyone just willed someone to get better. It didn't always work, and when someone died, because yes, people died, they didn't talk about it in complicated words. There were no eulogies, no long speeches, just a stillness, a shared moment, a pile of stones, a mound of earth, a small token left behind, like a carved piece of bone or a feather tucked near the hand. Then silence. Then someone stirred the fire. Then they went on. Because grief was real, but the cold didn't care. You could cry, but you had to cry while gathering wood. You could remember, but you had to remember while keeping the fire alive. Sometimes things went wrong with the land itself. A storm would flatten the huts. The stream would freeze solid. Animals would vanish for days. And during those times, everything got quieter. Jokes faded. Meals shrank. People moved like they were underwater, slow, deliberate, trying not to break whatever hope was left. But even then, they didn't quit. The fire stayed lit. The routine continued. One person would still scrape the hide. Another would still boil the bones, even when it felt pointless. Especially then, Because routine was survival, because structure was comfort, because pretending things were okay, even just for a few hours, sometimes helped them actually feel that way. Cavemen didn't get the luxury of optimism, but they had something else. Stubbornness. When things broke, they didn't philosophize. They patched it, they tied it, they tried again. And when someone stumbled, someone else offered a hand. Not because it was noble, not because they expected praise, but because one person falling behind could mean everyone fell behind. So they helped, quietly, without speeches. That's just what you did. Out here, survival wasn't dramatic. It was quiet persistence. It was carrying on, even when your stomach was empty and your shoes were falling apart and you weren't even sure what day it was anymore. And somehow, that was enough. When the sun dipped below the trees and the world turned black faster than anyone wanted, it was time to come inside. If inside meant anything, usually just a hut, a lean-to, a rough shelter half covered in hides and hope. The fire was already going, or someone was working hard to coax it back to life with a bundle of half-damp grass. You didn't wait for a second spark. If it caught, you fed it, because fire wasn't decoration. It was heat, light, cooking, comfort, and courage. After dark, everything changed. The world outside became a place you didn't visit unless you had to. It creaked, it moved. Sometimes you heard breathing out there, and you didn't want to find out if it was human. Inside, people huddled close, not because they wanted to chat, but because the fire didn't stretch far, and warmth was a shared resource. The youngest sat nearest. The elders stayed close too, because bones ached more in the cold. There was food, if you were lucky. Maybe some root mash. Maybe a bone stew that had been boiled and reboiled until the broth turned cloudy and the marrow gave up. They passed bowls, shared bites, chewed slowly. And then silence. Not awkward silence. Just normal. Because there wasn't a soundtrack to life. Just the pop of resin in the flames. The shuffle of someone adjusting their seat on a fur mat. The low breathing of people who had already drifted off. But sometimes, when things felt calm enough, or tired enough, or maybe just sacred in that wordless way, someone spoke. It wasn't a performance. There was no gather round, children. Someone just started talking. A memory. A joke. A time they nearly stepped on a snake and lived to tell the tale. The stories were never long. They were rarely complete, and they almost never made perfect sense. But that wasn't the point. A tale about the time the river froze so solid you could walk across it without breaking stride. A half-true account of the day. They caught a deer with nothing but a stick and a lucky stumble. People added bits. Someone would grunt in agreement. Someone else would shake their head and mutter, "That's not how I heard it." It was less like telling stories, and more like passing around a soft, warm object for everyone to hold on to. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were memory. They were tradition. They were how you reminded yourself that you came from something, that others had struggled too, that cold nights and hard times weren't new. They didn't have mythology yet, not the kind carved into temples or written into tablets, but they had folklore, a shadow spotted in the trees, a bird that never called more than once, the idea that someone, something, watched over them when the fire got low and the wind got weird, and yes, sometimes someone would swear they heard footsteps outside, just past the glow, software measured, familiar and not. Everyone would go quiet. Someone would throw another stick on the fire, just in case. And the story would pause, never ended, just left open, like a trapdoor that no one really wanted to peek under. That was the rhythm. Food, fire, flickers of memory. half laughs, half truths, and slowly the sound of breathing as people drifted off one by one, until only the fire was awake, crackling, humming, watching, and even it would grow tired. There was no bedtime. Sleep came when your body gave up, when your back couldn't carry the day anymore, when your legs stopped twitching from the cold. No one tucked you in. If you were lucky, you fell asleep under a fir. If you weren't, you curled up next to someone warmer and hoped they didn't snore loud enough to call predators. A good night meant not waking up shivering. A bad night meant not waking up at all. There weren't bedrooms, just space, shared space. A patch of earth just dry enough, soft enough, and close enough to the fire that your teeth didn't chatter themselves loose. Some nights, you didn't lie down all the way. You sat hunched, knees tucked, arms folded across your chest, half sleeping, half listening. Because even asleep, you had to be alert. The wind outside could shift just enough to sound like breathing, or worse, like footsteps. And dreams weren't stories. They were warnings. They were shadows burned onto the back of your eyelids. A rustle in the grass that woke you up gasping, only to find the fire had gone low and everyone else was still breathing. People didn't talk about their dreams in the morning, not because they weren't important, but because sometimes they came true. So you slept quietly, uneasily. The fire cracked, the cold crept in, and you learned to balance just enough rest with just enough readiness. Children slept in clusters, curled like kittens, tangled in their siblings' legs and elbows. Older ones sometimes woke up to swap places with the adults on night watch. And night watch wasn't a job. It was just whoever happened to still be awake. You didn't need to be brave. You just needed to be conscious. Long enough to toss another log into the fire, or throw a stone toward a rustle that was probably nothing. But maybe not. If you heard breathing that wasn't familiar, you didn't investigate. You shook someone else awake. That was the rule. Don't go outside alone. Don't be the first to speak. And never, never chase a sound into the dark. The best spot in the shelter, close to the fire, but not too close. You didn't want sparks catching your fur or your hair. It happened. You'd wake up smelling like singed regret. The worst spot, near the door, or whatever passed for one. A flap of hide, a woven mat, a poorly placed log. That was the draft zone, the place where every cold breeze sneaked in like it had personal beef with your ankles. You'd shuffle away from it, slowly through the night, waking up a foot to the left, wrapped in someone else's blanket, apologizing in the morning, or pretending you didn't notice. It wasn't glamorous. There was no lullaby, just the hum of crickets, if they were still alive, the distant scream of something hunting, and the ache of your own body trying to rest before another day of doing it all again. But still, somehow, people slept. Not deeply, not soundly, but enough to survive, enough to wake up, enough to start the fire again. And that was everything. By now, our imaginary caveman has woken up, helped stoke the fire, maybe chewed on something leathery that technically qualifies as food, and watched the little ones scatter to their chores. But what about the grown-ups? Not the warriors, not the ones off tracking mammoth or painting themselves with berry juice and calling it camouflage. We're talking about the backbone of the clan, the adults who stayed behind. Because survival wasn't just a morning task. It was an all-day, everyday hustle. If you were an adult in a Paleolithic group, your day likely revolved around production, repair, and preparation. And no, not the Pinterest kind. Stone tools wore down. Spears snapped. Leather bindings loosened. Baskets frayed. There was always something that needed mending, sharpening, stitching, or replacing. Knapping flint wasn't just a skill, it was an art. Sitting cross-legged on a flat stone, someone would take a larger rock and carefully chip away at a flint core, creating razor-sharp edges with surgical precision. One wrong strike and you didn't get a spearhead. You got gravel. Nearby, another person might be working sinew into cord, twisting, pulling, stretching, turning animal tendon into the prehistoric version of duct tape. Flexible, durable, and strong enough to lash together a spear, repair a shelter, or tie up a bundle of gathered herbs. Someone else would be shaping bone needles, whittling down slivers of antler until they were thin enough to pass through hide, but still strong enough not to snap mid-stitch. These needles were precious. Drop one in the dirt, and the entire household might spend the afternoon crawling around like archaeologists of their own backyard. Animal hides had to be scraped clean, then softened by hand, often with brains. Yes, literally. Animal brains contain emulsifying agents that helped condition the hides. Which means, somewhere in that camp, someone was rubbing moose brain into a deerskin and calling it progress. And that's not even counting basket weaving, cordage braiding, resin melting, or grinding acorns into something edible. Each task slow, deliberate, and often done by hand, usually while sitting in the dirt and hoping it didn't rain again. So while the hunters chased dinner, the makers kept the world from falling apart. They didn't make headlines, but they made everything else. Meanwhile, in another corner of the camp, something more fragrant, or at least less leathery, was underway. Food preparation wasn't just about throwing meat on a fire and calling it a day. It was an ongoing performance of patience, technique, and a good amount of guesswork. Because half the time, you didn't even know what you'd be cooking until it showed up, possibly still squirming. Roots had to be dug. Not just pulled, dug. Because many of them were stubborn little trolls hiding under the earth, surrounded by rocks and sass. Some roots could kill you. Others could feed you for days. And they looked exactly the same. So unless you enjoyed high-stakes snacking, you learned fast which ones to roast and which ones to fear. Back near the fire pit, someone was probably pounding dried meat or grinding seeds with a couple of stones that had seen better days. The pestle wasn't some pristine marble artifact. It was just the right-sized rock, shaped by repetition and time. The result? Something between powder and paste, often mixed with animal fat to make an early form of trail food. Portable, dense, and about as exciting as licking a brick. And then there were the acorns. Oh, the acorns. They were everywhere, falling like nature's little prank gifts. Technically edible, but only after soaking, leaching, grinding, and cooking, all to remove the tannins that made them taste like bitter soap. So naturally, someone would spend half the day repeatedly changing the water in a hollowed-out log full of mashed-up nut pulp, muttering quiet prehistoric curses under their breath. But food prep wasn't just survival. It was social. People chatted, grunted, passed around morsels, told stories, laughed at that one guy who tried to roast an egg on a hot rock and ended up with nothing but sadness and shell. Smoke drifted. Ash settled into everything. And through it all, the quiet rhythm of scraping, grinding, and stirring filled the camp like a soundtrack for the unglamorous but vital act of staying alive. Because at the end of the day, nobody cared how cool your spear was if dinner didn't happen. You couldn't eat ambition. You ate boiled root mash with a side of squirrel, if you were lucky. And tomorrow, the whole process would start again. While some tended fire, and others ground seeds into gritty optimism, one job never seemed to pause: gathering. Because the forest didn't stock shelves, and nobody was doing you the favor of organizing plants by edibility. Every day, a few adults, and often the sharpest-eyed teens, would venture out with baskets slung over their backs, eyes scanning the underbrush for anything remotely nutritious. Berries, tubers, mushrooms, nuts, wild greens. and the occasional accidental handful of absolutely not food. Identifying what was safe to eat wasn't about labels or nutrition facts. It was trial and error passed down through generations. You knew what wouldn't kill you because your great aunt had eaten the wrong thing and turned purple. Now, her story lived on as a cautionary tale every time you eyed a funny-looking mushroom. But even when you found something safe, there was no guarantee it was pleasant. Many wild plants were chewy, bitter, or had the texture of disappointment. Still, they were calories, and calories meant another sunrise. Mushrooms, in particular, were a gamble, wrapped in a mystery wrapped in fungus. Some were edible delicacies, others caused vivid hallucinations or immediate regret, and none of them came with instructions. So foragers developed a mental catalogue of "this one's okay" versus "this one made Uncle Dog try to fight a tree." And the work was non-stop. What was gathered today was eaten tomorrow, or dried, or forgotten, and turned into a science experiment in the back of a hut. Foraging wasn't just seasonal. It was a full-time job that changed with every shift in weather, every migration, every unexpected wildfire or mudslide that came through and rearranged the local buffet. But gathering wasn't all grim practicality. It also meant stories, gossip, and quiet moments in the woods where you could pretend, for just a few minutes, that survival didn't require constant vigilance. You could admire a patch of wildflowers. You could find a rock shaped like a duck. You could remember that life wasn't only about hunger and repairs. It was also about noticing. Then you'd trip over a root and spill your hard-earned berries. Nature has a way of humbling you just when you start to relax. Still, the gatherers trudged on, because no matter how sharp your spear or how warm your fire, someone had to bring home the plants. Someone had to feed the future. And sometimes, the future tasted a lot like slightly fermented tuber mash. Back at camp, where the air smelled faintly of smoke, sweat, and whatever passed for stew, another quiet rhythm of the day carried on. Cooking. Now, cooking in the Paleolithic world wasn't about recipes or seasoning to taste. It was about turning whatever you had, roots, scraps, questionable mushrooms, into something that didn't actively fight back while chewing. There were no spice racks, no timers, no ceramic bowls with cheerful slogans, just hot stones, smoke, and the kind of culinary improvisation that bordered on wizardry. A typical meal might begin with a pot, if you were lucky enough to have one, balanced over coals. Into it went water or snow, followed by a chaotic selection of ingredients. A few chopped tubers, some dried meat, crushed acorns, wild greens, maybe a snail or two. No one asked questions. If it didn't kill you last time, it was officially part of the recipe. Some cooking was done with hot stones, literally placing heated rocks into a water-filled pit to boil the contents. This worked surprisingly well, assuming you didn't crack the pot or scald your eyebrows. Roasting was another favorite. Meat was skewered on sticks and propped near the fire, turning slowly if you had the patience, or charred on one side and raw on the other if you didn't. But the real stars of the Paleolithic kitchen were the embers. Burying food in hot ash and letting it slow cook through the day was a common trick. You'd wrap roots or small animals in leaves or bark, toss them in the coals, and hope the result leaned more tender than incinerated. Bonus points if you remembered where you buried dinner. And flavour, let's be honest, most meals tasted like smoke and perseverance. But once hunger kicked in, your standards relaxed dramatically. Children gnawed on roasted bones, elders sucked on marrow, and everyone had at least one story about the time they bit into something that turned out to still be alive. Even mealtime wasn't purely about eating. It was also about warmth, togetherness, and the rare moment where people sat, shared, and didn't have to think about mammoths or mouldy shelters, or whether the berries they ate earlier were secretly poisonous. It was the one time of day when the world slowed down, where the fire crackled just loud enough to drown out the wind, where food, whatever it was, became more than just survival. It became comfort. And in a world where tomorrow's hunt wasn't promised and tonight's shelter was a gamble, that comfort meant everything. After the midday meal, or whatever portion of scorched root and boiled sinew passed for it, the rhythm of the camp shifted again. This was a quieter stretch, a strange, in-between moment when the sun hung low, but not yet gone, and everyone moved a little slower, like the day itself was holding its breath. For many, this was the time for maintenance, not just the tools or the fire, but the body. If you had a splinter, a cracked tooth, or a weird rash, now was your window to deal with it. Paleolithic medicine was creative. There were no doctors, no waiting rooms, no soothing music piped through a speaker. There was moss and sharp stones and the unshakable optimism that maybe chewing on willow bark might help the pain. If someone had a toothache, the solution could range from poke it with a stick to yank it out with sinew cord and a rock. There was no Novocaine, just grit, distraction, and a few people holding your shoulders down. Wounds were rinsed with cold water or smoked over burning herbs, because if nothing else, it smelled like you were trying. Some believed in poultices made from mashed roots or tree sap. Others relied on the ancient healing powers of rub dirt on it and keep moving. And if you were lucky enough to avoid infection, congratulations. You just won the prehistoric lottery. But body maintenance wasn't all dramatic. Some people stretched sore joints near the fire. Others rubbed animal fat into dry, cracked skin. And if your feet were bleeding through the sole of your wraparound sandals, well, it was a great day to invent sitting still. Children with fevers were wrapped in furs and fed lukewarm broth. Elders with aching bones might get a bit of warm ash pressed into their hands, or a gently sung chant to ease them into a nap. There was care in this chaos, primitive, clumsy, but genuine, because even in a world of predators, cliffs, and wild storms, sometimes the worst enemy was your own body turning on you. And so they adapted, passed down tricks, remembered what worked, forgot what didn't. Not out of science, out of necessity. And for one brief hour each day, the focus wasn't hunting, building, or braving the elements. It was survival of a different kind, the quiet, stubborn kind that happens when someone takes the time to check a wound, or rub a sore back, or offer a boiled root to a coughing child. It was messy. It was imperfect. And it was medicine. Of course, not everything in the day revolved around survival and injuries and chewing on sticks that may or may not have been food. Cavemen also had relationships. No, not candle-lit dinners and long walks by the river. More like quiet grunts of approval, shared scraps of meat, and the occasional act of not stealing each other's tools. Romance in the Paleolithic age was subtle and entirely practical. Pair bonding likely existed, but it didn't come with vows or engraved rings. It came with helping each other tan hides, raising offspring, and occasionally not arguing over who had the better fire-starting technique. And yes, there were arguments, sometimes over food, sometimes over who tracked mud into the shelter, sometimes just because someone snored louder than a mammoth in heat. But emotional life still pulsed through the camp. There were bonds, affections, irritations, probably even inside jokes, though instead of punchlines, they were communicated through raised eyebrows and the universal "you had to be there" of shared trauma involving saber-tooths. Older couples might be seen sitting side by the fire, silently stringing sinew together or fixing a broken spear. Not speaking, but comfortable. Like they'd survived so many winters, words were just extra calories. Meanwhile, young adults navigated the awkward chaos of courtship. No apps, no love songs, just someone blushing after handing you the sharper of their 2 stone knives. There were probably rituals too, quiet ones, gestures, a gift of honeycomb, a freshly smoothed stone, helping someone scrape a hide, even when yours wasn't done yet. And when those connections took root, they meant something. Because in a world that could kill you with a loose rock or a spoiled root, trust was rare and precious. Friendships were forged the same way, through shared tasks, quiet support, a shoulder during loss, a laugh when the stew exploded because someone forgot to vent the hide-wrapped pot. Affection wasn't always loud, but it was present. Some kids were raised by their parents, others by grandparents or unrelated adults. The group parented together because the group survived together. There weren't timeouts or parenting books. There was instinct, observation, and a lot of "don't put that in your mouth." There was grief, too, quiet, heavy, and carried differently by everyone. A lost child, a vanished hunter, a sudden sickness. In a time with no formal funerals, mourning still had its place, sometimes marked by a painted handprint on stone, or a fire kept burning longer than usual. So while we picture these early humans as all muscle and grit and cave wall sketches, they were also people, messy, caring, frustrated, joyful, lonely, proud. They might not have written poetry, but they knew what it felt like to miss someone. And in the middle of harsh winters and harder days, it was that emotional thread, the warmth of another's presence, that made survival a little less brutal. No epic speeches, just small kindnesses. Not love songs, just shared silence. But that was enough. As the sun drifted across the sky, assuming clouds allowed you to see it, another part of daily life crept in, gathering. Because even with hunters bringing back the occasional chunk of meat, most of the actual calories came from the quiet, thankless job of collecting plants, roots, berries, and whatever else hadn't been trampled, poisoned, or guarded by something with horns. This wasn't a leisurely stroll through a farmer's market. It was a strategic game of, is this edible, or will it make me see ghosts? Foragers moved slowly, eyes on the ground, baskets slung from shoulders, some bent double, poking under logs, others standing still, chewing leaves, trying to decide if it was minty or lethal. Knowledge passed down through generations was everything. You had to know what to pick, when to pick it, and whether that purple thing was food or just a dare from nature. Mushrooms were especially tricky. One wrong choice, and suddenly Uncle Roker was dancing with invisible elk again. Nobody wanted a repeat of that. And then there was the digging, tubers and roots, the unsung heroes of prehistoric cuisine, hardy, dense, and just bland enough to eat 6 days in a row without complaint. If you could unearth them, that is, which often meant stabbing at the frozen earth with sticks, stone wedges, or your own frustration. If it rained recently, good luck. You were now a mud sculpture. If it hadn't rained, the ground fought back like it had a grudge. Still, gatherers worked in pairs or groups, quietly joking, sharing tips, teaching the young ones the difference between edible and please hand me that leaf, we need to induce vomiting. And then there were the berries, sweet, juicy rewards for an otherwise bitter landscape. Of course, they came with their own problems, thorns, bears, and the unspoken competition of who could fill their basket without accidentally eating half of it first. Sometimes someone would bring back honey. This was rare, because getting honey meant climbing a tree, smoking out bees, stealing their life's work and trying not to die in the process. But if it worked, oh, that day was a holiday. Then came the drying, the storing, the hiding of your best finds in places you hoped no one else would check. Because nothing hurt quite like turning around to find your carefully gathered stash had been turned into snacks by a wandering child with sticky hands and no shame. Gathering was slow work, repetitive. but it was crucial, and it taught everyone an important truth. Survival wasn't about glory. It was about paying attention, knowing what to trust, knowing where to look, and knowing, always, that the forest provided, but only if you treated it with patience and respect. The day wasn't just about big, heroic hunts. Sometimes it was about kneeling in the dirt for 6 hours trying to find the right fern. And sometimes that fern was dinner. Meanwhile, deep in the camp, or rather in the general direction of where people usually sat to do important things, the problem of food preparation began. Because catching food was one thing, turning it into something chewable without breaking a tooth or starting a fire in the wrong place, that was an entirely different ritual. First came the butchering, and this wasn't some clean, stainless steel process. This was crouching in the dirt, elbow deep in steam and sinew, trying to separate edible bits from the bits that would definitely attract wolves if left out too long. Every part of the animal had a purpose. The hide was for shelter, the sinew for thread, the bones for tools, and the organs, well, sometimes they were considered delicacies. Sometimes they were buried with a stick. Depends who you asked. And then came the real challenge. The meat itself. No freezers, no fridges. Just air drying, smoking, or burying it in cold earth and hoping nature behaved. Smoking meat was a community effort. A fire had to be kept low, steady, and smoky. Just the right balance of heat and irritation. Someone was always coughing nearby. The racks were made of wood, propped up by whatever logs hadn't already become someone's seating. Strips of meat dangled in rows, waving gently like primitive wind chimes, each one a potential dinner or disaster depending on how the fire behaved. Then came the grinding of nuts, seeds, and whatever other things you found and desperately hoped were food. This meant stone tools again. One big, flat slab and one rounded grinder. It looked simple, but within 10 minutes, your shoulders ached and your hands went numb. And for what? A handful of greyish paste that tasted like bitter dust, but kept you alive another day. Soup was another common outcome. You'd toss in whatever you had, meat scraps, roots, wild herbs, maybe a frog if things were going sideways, and let it bubble until everything blended into something vaguely edible. Flavor wasn't really the point. Warmth and digestibility were the goals, and if it managed to not poison you, that was a bonus. There was no recipe book, no measuring cups, just the deep ancestral instinct of add more hot rocks until it smells less like feet. Yes, hot rocks. You didn't cook over a fire so much as in it. You'd heat stones in the coals, then transfer them into watertight containers made from animal stomachs or thick hide, effectively boiling your ingredients by rock transfer. Sometimes the rocks cracked, sometimes the stomach burst. Always an adventure. And of course, the food had to be shared. No one cooked just for themselves. Meals were communal. People gathered around the fire, passed bowls, and used fingers or chewed on sticks. Elders were served first, children got the softer pieces, and if there was anything left over, it went to the dogs, or back into the stew for tomorrow. There were no picky eaters, only hungry ones. Even burnt bits were eaten, especially the burnt bits, because if someone dropped a hot stone into the soup and scorched the bottom, congratulations. Tonight's flavor was char. Still, despite the smoke, the noise, and the questionable textures, mealtime was sacred. A pause in the long daily march of survival. A moment to sit, to listen, to laugh, and to quietly wonder if maybe, just maybe, that one mushroom had been a mistake. Once the food was cooked, or at least warmed to the point of not actively frozen, the cleanup began. Except cleanup is a generous term. There were no sinks, no soap, no running water, just dirt ashes, and the occasional handful of snow. Leftovers weren't scraped into a bin. They were either eaten by the dogs, buried, or fed to whoever wandered into camp late and looked hungry enough to try anything. Bones were cracked open for marrow. Skins were dried for later use. And that questionable bit of stew crusted onto the side of a hide bowl. That was future flavor. You didn't clean bowls. You seasoned them, accidentally, over time, with a rich tapestry of meals past. And if you happened to drop your eating stick into the ashes, you simply blew on it and moved on. Hygiene was a concept, yes, just not a high priority. Meanwhile, the fire needed tending again. Always the fire. Someone would shuffle over with a half-burned log, poke the embers with a stick that was also technically a tool, and mutter something under their breath that probably translated to, "Why is it always me?" The fire wasn't just a heat source. It was the Wi-Fi, microwave, and security system of its time. Let it die, and the consequences were immediate. No light, no warmth, no dinner, and a long, terrifying night, wondering if that rustling sound was wind or something with more teeth than sense. So one or two unlucky souls stayed on ember duty, rotating logs, adding kindling, and watching smoke drift lazily into the sky, or directly into their eyes. No chimneys meant every conversation ended with a coughing fit, and someone waving their hands like they were fending off bees. While all this was happening, people rotated through jobs that weren't quite jobs, but still needed doing. Someone inspected the hides drying on racks, grunting in approval or confusion, depending on whether they were still damp or already frozen stiff. Someone else patched a cracked water pouch using sinew, tree resin, and a prayer. Someone checked the food storage pit, where smoked meat and dried roots were cached beneath layers of bark and moss. If the smell was suspiciously off, well, dinner plans changed. And crucially, someone always had their eye on the weather. Cavemen didn't have forecasts, but they had instincts. A shift in wind, the way the birds moved, or the texture of snow underfoot. These were signs. If the air felt wrong, everyone knew what that meant. Time to brace. That could mean reinforcing shelters with more brush and hide. It could mean double layering cloaks. It could mean stuffing extra moss into every drafty corner. Whatever it took to hold back the cold just a little longer. And all the while, kids darted between legs, animals nosed their way into everything, and someone inevitably asked, "Is that smoke supposed to smell like that?" No matter how routine the day became, there was always some small emergency. A burned hand, a missing child, a goat with opinions. But somehow, by sunset, things quieted again. People returned to the fire. They sat, ate, scratched at mosquito bites from last season, and watched the shadows stretch across camp. There was no grand ceremony, no applause, just a long exhale, a few half-laughed stories, and the faint, shared hope that tomorrow might be a little easier. Though deep down, they all knew it wouldn't be. But they'd do it anyway, because this was life. And dinner, even if slightly burnt, was a win. As the fire dimmed and the last scraps of dinner disappeared into bellies, or dogs, the camp entered its quietest hours. But quiet didn't mean peaceful. Night was when the real negotiations began. Not with enemies. Not even with nature. With sleep. Because drifting off wasn't as simple as lying down and closing your eyes. You had to earn your rest. First came the sleeping arrangements, which were less arranged and more whoever fell over first gets that spot. Beds weren't beds. They were furs and hides spread over cold earth, maybe stuffed with moss if you were feeling fancy. If your particular spot didn't slope downhill or smell like yesterday's stew, you considered it luxury real estate. And the blanket situation, communal. Furs were piled high and shared across whoever was closest. Families bundled together into shivering clumps of elbows, knees, and whispered grumbling. If you ended up face to face with Uncle Og's breath all night, that was just fate. Privacy didn't exist. Personal space was a myth. And if someone got up to pee, you bet everyone heard it. But even after all that, falling asleep wasn't guaranteed. Because the night had a personality, and it was needy. The wind would rise just as you were drifting off. Not a breeze, but a howl, like the sky itself was complaining. The kind of sound that makes your bones tense, even if you've heard it 1,000 times. Then there were the animals. Owls screeched, foxes yipped, wolves howled. And at least once a week, something unfamiliar barked or wailed from the tree line. And no one wanted to be the one to check what it was. Inside camp, it wasn't much better. Someone snored like they were being haunted. Someone else kept coughing from the smoke. And some poor soul inevitably muttered, "Did anyone bank the fire?" prompting a groggy scramble and someone stepping directly into last night's cooking ashes. Still, there was comfort in the noise, because total silence, that was worse. That meant something wasn't right. In a way, the soundscape of night, rustling trees, cracking embers, half-mumbled dreams, was the lullaby, a reminder you weren't alone. So eventually, people did sleep, sort of, in fits and starts, shifting constantly, waking at every creak or cold breeze or phantom toe nibble from the camp dog. It wasn't the sleep of luxury, but it was survival sleep, the kind that got you just rested enough to do it all again tomorrow. And when the sky began to grey, barely perceptible from the night before, someone would rise, stretch with a groan, and toss a log onto the coals. Because the world didn't pause, not even at night. And as soon as that fire caught again, the whole cycle began anew. If there was one universal truth about prehistoric life, it was this: everything took longer than you thought it would. Lighting a fire wasn't a flick of a match. It was a full-body ritual. Cooking a meal wasn't fast. It was half your day. And gathering food, that wasn't an errand. It was an expedition. When the sun offered just enough light to see your own hands, the foragers started moving. These weren't the big game hunters charging across plains. These were the quiet experts, the ones who knew what roots were edible, which mushrooms wouldn't kill you, and where the berries grew even when the frost said otherwise. They didn't have shopping baskets. They had baskets they made themselves, from twisted reeds and hope, and they filled them one careful handful at a time. Mushrooms had to be sliced, sniffed, second-guessed. Nuts had to be pried from frozen dirt or plucked from trees at odd angles. And roots? Those had to be dug up using sticks or fingers, while praying they hadn't turned woody or bitter. There were no labels, no expiration dates, just generations of quiet knowledge passed down one muttered warning at a time. Don't eat that. Rub this on your wrist before picking. If the birds won't touch it, maybe you shouldn't either. Meanwhile, others scanned trees for signs of birds' nests or tapped bark to check for hidden insects. Yes, bugs. Protein was protein, and if they didn't bite back, they counted as calories. No part of the land was ignored. A patch of moss might mean water nearby. A cracked branch could point to a deer trail. A specific ant hill might lead to edible tubers. It was a scavenger hunt, except the prize was not dying. And sometimes it paid off. A stash of hazelnuts, a patch of sorrel, a lucky snare with a rabbit twitching inside. Every find was a celebration, not the dancing kind, more like a quiet nod, a shared glance, and the immediate calculation of how many mouths it could feed. Then came the long walk back, feet cold, baskets heavy, but spirits slightly higher, because tonight's stew might actually have something in it. And for just a moment, around the flickering fire, someone might say, "This tastes different." And someone else might reply, "That's because it's food." Let's talk about water. Not the kind that comes from a tap. Not the kind with a filtration system or a friendly blue label that says spring-fed. We're talking about prehistoric water, where every sip was a calculated risk. In the Paleolithic world, water was never just there. You had to go find it. That meant following animal tracks, scanning for damp soil, or listening for the faint sound of a stream beyond the trees. And once you found a source, you didn't just dunk your face in and call it a day. You looked for floating things first. That was rule number 1. If the bugs avoided it, that was a red flag. If the bugs loved it, also a red flag. Welcome to hydration roulette. Fetching water was a group task. It wasn't glamorous. There were no shiny jugs, just hollowed gourds, clay pots, or tightly woven baskets lined with pitch. You carried them on your back, in your arms, or balanced on a strap across your forehead, trying not to spill a week's worth of walking. And the weight. Water doesn't care that you're barefoot and trudging through mud. It's heavy. Cavemen didn't need gym memberships. They just needed a leaky container and a distant stream. Then there was the problem of keeping it clean. Some camps buried small clay pots near the fire so they'd stay warm and discourage bugs. Others set up systems where dripping water slowly filtered through sand and charcoal. Was it perfect? Number. Was it genius? Absolutely. Sometimes they boiled it if they had the fuel, the time, and a pot that hadn't cracked the day before. And if you were really lucky, someone remembered not to scoop from the part of the river the animals used as their personal spa and toilet. But still, despite every precaution, water was risky business. Parasites, bacteria, strange smells, you name it, they drank it. Not because they were reckless, but because the human body has this funny habit of needing water, constantly. And if it wasn't the cleanest, well, there were herbs for that, usually bitter, always questionable, but they might stop your stomach from trying to leave your body. So every sip was a gamble, every trip was a chore, and every empty gourd was a reminder. You weren't surviving unless you were walking toward water. Now imagine you're back from the water run. Your arms ache, your back's sore. You've spilled half the haul thanks to one poorly placed root and a bird that startled you mid-step. And as you step back into camp, someone gestures to the fire pit. It's gone out, not just flickered, not just low, cold, no smoke, Nink's ember, just a heap of yesterday's ash and the distant sound of your pride walking away. Keeping the fire alive was more than convenience, it was survival. It cooked your food, warmed your kids, kept the animals and spirits at bay, and reigniting it, not easy. There were no lighters, no matches, just 2 sticks and a very strong belief in friction. Enter the fire maker, usually someone with calloused hands, good patience, and absolutely zero tolerance for small talk. Because starting a fire from scratch meant sitting cross-legged, balancing a spindle on a dry wooden base and spinning it fast enough to summon smoke, with a bow drill if you were lucky, with your bare palms if you weren't. The heat came slowly. First, the faint scent of scorched wood, then the whisper of smoke, and finally, if the gods were kind, a glowing coal, tiny, fragile, like holding life itself. That coal got tucked into a bundle of dry tinder, shredded bark, dry grass, or a bundle of that weird, fluffy stuff someone swore worked last time. You'd blow on it gently, then harder, then whisper to it like it was a child refusing to wake up for school. If it caught flame, victory. Immediate elevation to camp hero. Someone might even give you the last piece of dried mushroom as thanks. If it didn't, you started over. Because without fire, dinner was raw, the night was cold, and everyone looked at you like you'd personally cancelled warmth. Some families kept embers burning all night, covered gently in ash to preserve them till morning. Others rotated the job. Your turn to sleep next to the hearth, they'd say, like it wasn't an anxiety-riddled shift filled with smoke and coughing fits. But even with all the effort, fire had a habit of going out at the worst time, like during a sudden storm, or just as someone muttered, "At least we've got a good flame tonight." Lesson learned: never brag about a fire. It's listening. Now let's talk about food prep, because once the fire was going and no one dared jinx it again, it was time to turn raw ingredients into something vaguely edible. There was no recipe scroll, no list of pantry staples, just whatever you had on hand, which might include half a dried fish, 3 edible roots, some acorn mush, and a deeply suspicious mushroom that someone swore was fine last time. Meals weren't about flavor, they were about survival. But even survival took effort. Roots had to be scrubbed free of dirt, then boiled or roasted, or chewed long enough to forget they tasted like damp bark. Mushrooms were sliced carefully, with one person watching like a hawk for any signs of the bad kind. If you weren't sure, you didn't eat it, or you fed it to the goat and waited. And meat? If you were lucky enough to have some, it had to be butchered with care. Bone tools weren't always sharp. Flint blades dulled fast. So separating sinew from meat was less a cut-and-serve moment and more like a wrestling match between dinner and your patience. But the real fun? Grinding. Nuts. Seeds. Dried tubers. Everything needed to be pounded, crushed, mashed, or ground into something softer, ideally before your arms gave out. You'd use a stone mortar, a slab, or even just a flat rock and another rock. It was loud, it was messy. It was a full-body workout before eating anything. And don't even get started on shelling nuts. Hours of cracking, peeling, and trying not to smash the edible part into dust. The end result was edible. Sometimes, if not tasty, at least filling. Meals were eaten communally, sitting in a circle, everyone hunched forward, scooping food with fingers, bits of bark, or a lucky shard of cleaned bone. There was no fine dining, just silence, slurping, and the occasional child loudly announcing that something tastes like squirrel but worse. Salt? Rare. Spices. Dreams. The only seasoning you had was smoke, desperation, and the lingering tang of last night's stew still stuck to the pot. But there was a strange comfort in it, because when food was hot, the fire was strong, and everyone's hands were still attached. It meant you were winning, at least for that day. And the caveman calendar, it ran one dinner at a time. Once the midday meal was over, if you could call 2 boiled roots and a bit of squirrel a meal, the afternoon began. This was the stretch of time when fatigue set in. Not the cozy post-lunch drowsiness of modern life. Not the I could use a nap kind of tired. No, this was the bone-deep, sun-baked, rock-sitting weariness of people who had already done more before noon than most modern humans would do in 3 days. But there were no breaks. If the sun was still up, so were you. For some, that meant gathering. And gathering was never glamorous. It meant trekking through brush, squinting for the right plants, dodging wasps, and hoping the berries weren't the kind that made your uncle hallucinate last winter. You had to know the difference between edible, possibly edible, and funeral. It wasn't just berries, either. You gathered firewood, you gathered kindling, you gathered reeds for baskets, you gathered whatever the camp needed more of, which was usually everything. Others spent this time repairing. That tool you thought you fixed, still broken. That basket you patched up, now leaking like a nervous deer bladder. Repairs were endless, You didn't own 10 things. You owned 3. So if one broke, it mattered. Someone would be hunched over, retying sinew on a spear. Someone else muttering under their breath while trying to restitch a sandal. And there was always one poor soul with a splinter the size of a wolf fang and no clean way to get it out. And if you weren't gathering or fixing, you were preparing, maybe stretching a hide to dry, maybe helping carve a trench to keep water out of the shelter, maybe drying fish on a rack that creaked every time the wind hinted at rain. Everything was done with intent, but very little was done with ease. There were no shortcuts, no convenience, just the dull rhythm of necessity and the slow ache of shoulders that hadn't stopped working since sunrise. Still, even in the tired lull of afternoon, the camp never stopped humming. Children chased each other with half-carved sticks. Someone poked the fire, even though it was fine. Someone else shouted that the dog had run off with the last piece of hide. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and dust, but also life. In a way, that dusty chaos was its own kind of order, because as long as things were being mended, stirred, scraped, and stacked, it meant the group was still moving forward, even if it was one cracked basket and burnt squirrel at a time. As the sun dipped lower, and let's be honest, it was never that high to begin with, the camp began its slow pivot toward evening. You didn't end the day in a Paleolithic village. You coasted into it, like a wagon with a wobbly wheel and no brakes. The tasks didn't stop so much as shift. Water needed hauling. Again. That meant another walk to the stream, with sloshing gourds or animal bladders strapped to your back like sad, dripping backpacks. You prayed the stream hadn't frozen over. Or worse, that something upstream hadn't died in it. Back in camp, the fire needed feeding. Not just tossing on a log, fire was moody. It needed rearranging, coaxing, and protection from the wind. Half the time it smoked like it was offended. The other half it flared up like it was auditioning for a myth. Dinner, if you were lucky, was a group affair. Not group like a dinner party. More like everyone huddled around a pot and argued about whose turn it was to chew the tough bits. Boiled root, scraped marrow, charred meat that may or may not have fallen in the dirt before getting rescued with a shrug. But people laughed. Not because things were easy, but because humor was a survival tool too. A bad stew got a joke. A splinter got a groan and a dramatic limp. Someone's crooked spear got passed around like a community inside joke. And that one guy who always fell asleep near the fire probably woke up with soot drawn on his face and no one admitting to it. You'd think exhaustion would kill the mood. But sometimes that's when it got funnier. That slap-happy, slightly delirious kind of funny, where someone just blurts, "What if bears invented us?" And everyone laughs like it's profound. Then came the slow collapse. Tools put away, skins tied up, kids corralled, people gathered around the fire, their shadows flickering against stone and hide, stretching into strange, prehistoric shapes. It wasn't quiet, but it wasn't loud either. Just the low thrum of a day survived. And in the background, the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same. More gathering, more fixing, more chewing, more fire poking. But for now, just warmth, company, and the final burned edge of something that had once been food. As the fire settled into its nighttime rhythm, low, glowing, occasionally popping like it had a secret to tell, the real evening show began. Storytelling. This was Netflix, TED Talks, and therapy, all in one, delivered by the oldest person still awake. Every clan had one. The elder, the griot, the one with the long memory, the slow voice, and 1,000 stories so well rehearsed they could be told while stirring a pot or sharpening a bone tool. You didn't just listen, you leaned in, because stories were everything. They taught you what animals to fear, what berries not to eat, why it's a bad idea to follow that one cousin into the woods at night. But they weren't dry lectures. They were performances. There were sound effects, faces, gestures. The storyteller might howl, growl, stomp, whisper, or pause dramatically, just long enough to make a child scoot closer to their parent. Every story had a lesson, but it also had flair. The mammoth wasn't just big. It was the size of a storm. The warrior didn't just get lost. He walked so far he found the edge of the sky. And the hero didn't just escape. He outsmarted death with a pine cone and a really good lie. You weren't there just to learn. You were there to remember. Because one day, that story might be yours to tell. And heaven help you if you got it wrong. Forgetting a key part wasn't just embarrassing. It was borderline blasphemous. This was their encyclopedia, their cultural glue, their group therapy under the stars. Kids listened wide-eyed. Adults nodded. And the fire, if it was in a good mood, would flicker at all the right moments. And if the story hit just right, if it landed that perfect mix of fear, humor, and awe, someone would say, "Tell it again," even if they'd already heard it 100 times. Because in a world without written language, every retelling wasn't just repetition. It was survival. It was connection. It was proof that someone had made it through the dark and left a trail of words behind. And after the stories were told, after the kids had stopped asking for one more, and after someone finally put a lid on the bone broth before the dogs got into it, then came the final ritual of the night, arranging the sleeping pile. Yes, pile. There weren't bedrooms. There weren't even beds, not the kind we think of anyway. Just layers of fur, straw, cloaks, and the occasional half-tanned hide that smelled faintly of regret. The rule was simple. Get warm, stay warm. That meant the entire family, plus any hangers-on, snuggled up like a living lasagna. Elders on the bottom because they complained the least. Kids in the middle because they complained the most. Dogs on the edges. And somewhere near the fire, a goat. There was always a goat. It wasn't glamorous. Someone was always snoring. Someone was always kicking. And someone always had cold feet that somehow found your spine like they were on a mission. Privacy wasn't a thing. Modesty had limits. If you had to shift, scratch, or scoot something out from under you, you just did it. No one cared. Everyone smelled the same anyway. And yet, there was comfort in it. In the low hush of breath. In the faint crackle of the fire still doing its best. In the quiet murmur of someone muttering to themselves, trying to remember how the story really ended. Outside, the night pressed in, dark, cold, full of distant howls and shifting wind. But inside, it was warm enough to keep living, which, for them, was the point. There were no alarm clocks, just the light when it came, if it came. You'd wake to the sound of a crow, a creaking branch, or someone whispering, "Move over," for the 6th time. And just like that, the cycle would begin again. No one marked the days. No one needed to. As long as the fire stayed lit, and the pile stayed full, and the stories were still told. Life, however rough, was holding on. Now life wasn't just firewood and mammoth jerky. The mind needed warmth too. And when winter stretched on, when the wind began to howl in strange patterns and shadows lingered a little too long, people turned to something older than language itself, superstition. Because when you've done everything practical, when the hut is patched, the hides are hung, and the soup is boiling, and something still doesn't feel right, that's when you start whispering to the spirits. Every flickering flame, every cracked bone, every owl call in the night, it all meant something, or at least it could, and it was safer to assume it did. Take firewood, for example. You didn't just toss any old branch on the fire. Some wood was considered clean, some cursed. If a branch snapped too easily, it was bad luck. If it hissed and spit too much, the ancestors were angry. If it didn't burn, that's on you for gathering wood near the old burial pit. Again. And when it came to food, nothing was wasted. But certain pieces were set aside for the spirits. A shard of bone, a bit of fat, a burnt crust of something you weren't going to eat anyway. It wasn't about generosity, it was insurance, because no one wanted to be the reason winter got worse. Then there were the chants. Not songs, chants. Low, steady, rhythm-driven muttering. Part lullaby, part wishful thinking. Usually performed while stirring stew or rubbing warmth into frozen limbs. Keep the cold out, keep the fire bright, someone would mumble over and over until it almost became believable. And don't even joke about whistling indoors. That summoned the wind, or wolves, or your mother-in-law, depending on who you asked. At night, someone would mark the doorway with ash, or smear a circle of soot around the hearth to keep bad things from creeping in. Did it work? Who knows? But it gave people something to do with the leftover charcoal, and it made the kids feel better. Even dreams weren't off limits. A good dream, where the sun shone or berries grew, meant hope. A bad one, that was shared with the group at breakfast, like a warning label. I saw teeth in the sky, someone might say. Everyone would nod solemnly, then quietly add more wood to the fire and make sure their spear was sharpened. Some believed the first person to wake each day had to say something kind. If the first words spoken were angry or sharp, the day would go sour. So even if you stubbed your toe on a sleeping dog, you'd mutter, "Nice weather," with clenched teeth just to keep the balance. And if a crow landed near your camp in the morning, forget it. No one was going hunting, or fishing, or even walking past that log. It was a sign. Of what, exactly, no one knew. But you don't mess with signs. These weren't just rituals. They were anchors. When you live in a world where snow might fall for weeks, where food might vanish overnight, and where warmth is never guaranteed, a little magic goes a long way. Not because it worked, but because believing it might was often enough. As the sun slipped behind the trees and shadows stretched long across the snow-packed ground, the entire tone of camp life shifted. The urgency of the hunt was over. The repairs and scraping and grinding and weaving were wrapping up. But before anyone could huddle near the fire and pretend this rock was a couch, there were still a dozen little things left to do. Bones needed to be sorted, some saved for tools, others tossed. Wood had to be gathered, then stacked just right so the driest pieces could feed the morning fire. Hides stretched to dry all day had to be checked, repositioned, or pulled inside before frost stiffened them into useless sheets of frozen regret. The little ones were rounded up, not so much because it was bedtime, but because no one wanted to find them trying to ride a half-sleeping boar or balancing on a slippery boulder in the dark. Herding cave kids was a full-contact sport. Even in the quiet of dusk, there was motion everywhere. A woman softly singing as she braided cord. A man crouched near the fire, checking embers like he was reading tea leaves. Someone shaking out a fur and pretending it wasn't crawling with something that probably had too many legs. The smells changed too. Less smoke and char, more stew and animal fat. Dinner wasn't served with ceremony. It just happened, passed from hand to hand, scooped from a shared pot, and eaten while crouched or leaning or half asleep. Laughter might rise for a moment, echoing against the cave walls or tree trunks, and then fade into murmurs. The last light flickered across skin and fur and stone, and for just a second everything felt still, almost peaceful. But the real stillness, that belonged to night, and it was coming fast. Once the sun vanished, the rules changed. The cold didn't creep in. It slammed the door and sat on your chest. The world outside the fire's reach turned pitch black and bone brittle. If there were stars, no one looked up to admire them. Not when you were still trying to find your second most dry sock. There were no torches lighting the path to the bathroom. Mostly because there was no bathroom, just a very specific bush and a strong hope that nothing had made a nest there. Children were wrapped like burritos in fur and nudged into sleep piles. The oldest ones pretended they weren't scared. The youngest ones didn't pretend at all. And the adults, they didn't get to be scared. They were busy banking the fire, patching a draft, or whispering old stories just loud enough to distract from the howling wind, or the howling that might not be wind. Silhouettes huddled together, palms extended toward the hearth, eyes darting toward shadows that sometimes moved when they shouldn't. And yet there was routine in it, comfort even, in the way someone always snored first, in the way the smoke always stung your eyes, even though you swore you were sitting in a better spot tonight. There were no lullabies, just the crackle of firewood, the occasional cough, the shifting weight of someone rolling over, and outside, somewhere out there, the faint crunch of something walking on snow. But inside, the camp held, for another night. There was no certainty in that, just the fragile rhythm of it all, firelight on fur, soft breath rising in the cold, the knowledge that they had made it through one more winter day. And tomorrow, they'd do it all again, because rest wasn't guaranteed. It was earned. They didn't leave behind written words, no diaries, no bedtime poems scribbled in ink, but somehow their story still lingers. It lingers in the grooves of a stone tool worn smooth by calloused hands, in a fire-blackened cave wall, in a footprint pressed into ancient clay, small, bare, and nearly forgotten. These people, our distant kin, didn't think of themselves as remarkable. They didn't plan to be remembered. They were just trying to make it to spring. They fixed what broke. They warmed each other with breath and body. They passed down knowledge, one whisper at a time. Not because it was poetic, but because it kept them alive. And in the dark, in the wind, in the aching cold, they stayed. They stayed when the days were short and the hunger was long, when the babies cried and the elders faded, when the wind howled through every seam and the world felt like it might never thaw. They stayed. And somehow that was enough. So tonight, if your room is warm, if your lights hum softly, if your socks match, take a quiet moment. Not out of guilt, but out of awe. Because every warm bed, every full plate, every quiet evening, it all traces back to people who didn't give up. People who stared down the cold and whispered, "Not yet." And for all their silence, that might be the loudest thing they ever said.